I didn't know the email I sent at 11 p.m. would be opened by a publisher's legal team at 6 a.m. and result in federal marshals at my house by noon. My name is Simone Castellano, and for 2 years I watched my husband become a celebrated author using words I'd written while grieving my sister's death. The manuscript started as therapy. My younger sister, Gabriella, died in a car accident in January of 2021, and I couldn't function. Couldn't work, couldn't sleep, couldn't do anything except sit at my laptop and write. I wrote about sisters who loved each other fiercely, about loss that rewrites your entire identity, about grief that doesn't follow any timeline or rulebook. The words poured out of me like blood from a wound, and after 6 months, I had a complete novel, 347 pages. A literary fiction piece about 2 sisters navigating their mother's terminal illness while confronting their own complicated relationship. It was raw and painful, and the most honest thing I'd ever created. I titled it The Space Between Us. My husband, Colin, read it in July. I remember sitting on our couch watching his face as he turned pages on his tablet. He looked up after the final chapter with actual tears in his eyes. He said it was devastating, that it was beautiful, that publishers would be fighting over it. I felt something crack open in my chest, the first positive feeling I'd had since Gabriella died. Colin held me that night and said I was going to be a published author, that this book was going to change everything for us. I started querying agents in August. I'd researched the process obsessively, found agents who represented literary fiction, crafted personalized query letters. I sent out 50 queries over 3 months. I got 47 rejections. Form letters mostly. A few personalized ones saying the writing was strong, but the market for literary fiction was tough, or the story wasn't quite right for their list. 3 agents never responded at all. By November, I was exhausted and discouraged. Colin kept telling me not to give up, that rejection was part of the process, that I just needed to find the right agent, the right publisher, the right fit. In December, Colin started acting strange, secretive. He'd close his laptop when I walked into the room, take phone calls in the garage. He said it was work stuff, year-end reviews and performance evaluations. He was a marketing director for a mid-sized tech company, and I knew December was always stressful. I didn't push it. I was revising my manuscript for another round of queries, incorporating feedback from the few agents who'd given me detailed rejections. On January 4th, Colin came home from work with champagne. Good champagne. The kind we only bought for anniversaries. He was grinning like a lunatic. He said he had news. Big news. Life-changing news. I thought he'd gotten a promotion. He sat me down on the couch, held my hands, and said he'd sold a book, a manuscript he'd been working on secretly for 2 years. A publisher had loved it, made an offer, the deal had just closed. $75,000 advance, 2-book contract, publication scheduled for next fall. I stared at him. Colin had never mentioned writing a book, never talked about wanting to be an author. He worked in marketing. He read thriller novels on vacation. He'd never shown any interest in creative writing. I asked him what the book was about. He said it was literary fiction, about 2 sisters dealing with their mother's terminal illness, about grief and family and complicated relationships. My entire body went cold. I asked him what it was called. He said The Distance Between. I said that's almost the same as my title. He laughed and said great minds think alike, that he'd actually gotten the idea from watching me work through my grief over Gabriella, that seeing me write had inspired him to try it himself. I asked to read it. He said the manuscript was with the publisher, they were already starting edits. He'd give me a copy soon. He opened the champagne, poured 2 glasses. I drank mine because I didn't know what else to do. My brain was screaming that something was wrong, but I couldn't articulate what.
Colin had written a book with almost the same title as mine, about the same subject matter, and sold it for $75,000 while I'd gotten nothing but rejections. The coincidence felt impossible. But Colin wouldn't lie to me. We'd been married for 6 years. He'd supported my writing, encouraged it, read every draft. He'd held me through Gabriella's funeral. He loved me. I was being paranoid. Grief crazy. The kind of suspicious that comes from too much loss and too much disappointment. Except I wasn't paranoid, I was right. 2 weeks later, Colin left his laptop open on the kitchen table. He was in the shower. I wasn't snooping. I walked past and the screen was lit up with an email from someone named Jennifer Huang at Pinnacle Publishing House. The subject line said TDB manuscript, revision notes. I stopped walking. TDB, the distance between, Colin's book. I knew I shouldn't read his email, knew it was a violation of privacy. I read it anyway. Jennifer's email referenced specific scenes, the hospital room confrontation between the sisters, the mother's final birthday party, the younger sister's monologue about inherited trauma. I knew those scenes. I'd written those scenes. They were in my manuscript, in the space between us. Word-for-word scenes I'd agonized over, revised a dozen times, sent to agents who'd rejected them. My hands started shaking. I opened Colin's documents folder, found a file called TDB Final Draft, opened it, started reading. It was my manuscript. Every word, every paragraph, every chapter. He'd changed the title, changed the main characters' names from Gabriella and Simone to Hannah and Claire, changed a few location details, but the structure, the plot, the dialogue, the internal monologues, everything substantive was mine. He'd stolen my book and sold it as his own. I stood in our kitchen reading my own words under my husband's name, and I thought I might actually lose my mind. I screamed, actually screamed. Colin came running from the bathroom in a towel, water dripping from his hair, asked what was wrong. I turned the laptop toward him, asked him to explain. His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, concern. Then he tried to hug me. I shoved him away so hard he stumbled backward. He said I was misunderstanding. That yes, he'd used my manuscript as a starting point, but he'd transformed it, made it his own, changed enough that it was legally distinct, that my version had been rejected by everyone, that clearly it needed work, that he'd fixed it, improved it, made it publishable, that we were married, what was mine was his, and this way we'd both benefit from the advance money, that I should be happy, we were going to be published authors, together. I asked if his name was going to be on the cover. He said yes, just his name, because that was the contract he'd signed. But he'd dedicate the book to me, thank me in the acknowledgments. I'd get credit that way. I asked if the publisher knew the manuscript was based on my work. He said no, and I couldn't tell them, because if I did, they'd cancel the contract. We'd lose the $75,000. We'd lose the publication deal. Everything would be ruined over a technicality. I told him it wasn't a technicality, it was theft. He said I was being dramatic, that married couples collaborate all the time, that lots of famous authors had spouses who contributed to their work. I said those spouses weren't erased from the byline. He said I needed to calm down, that I was letting my emotions cloud my judgment, that the grief over Gabriella was making me irrational. I left the house, drove to my best friend Aisha's apartment, and told her everything. She stared at me for a long moment and then said we needed to call a lawyer. Not a divorce lawyer, an intellectual property lawyer, because what Colin had done wasn't just unethical, it was copyright infringement. It was fraud, and if we could prove it, we could stop the publication and get me the contract I deserved. I didn't go home that night. I stayed at Aisha's. Colin called 17 times, sent texts saying we needed to talk, that I was overreacting, that he loved me, that we could work this out. I blocked his number.
Aisha helped me find an attorney.
Her name was Diane Ortega, and she specialized in intellectual property disputes in publishing. I met with her the next morning. Diane asked if I had proof that I'd written the manuscript first. I said yes, I had everything. Every draft saved with timestamps going back 18 months. Every query letter I'd sent to agents with dates and responses. Every email exchange with agents who'd rejected me. Every revision with tracked changes showing my edits.
I had my manuscript in my name in my documents folder with creation dates that predated Colin's file by over a year. Diane said this was one of the clearest cases of copyright infringement she'd seen, that we needed to act fast before the book went to print, that once it was published, it became infinitely more complicated.
She said we'd send a cease and desist letter to Pinnacle Publishing, provide evidence that the manuscript was mine, demand they void Colin's contract, and offer the deal to me instead. I asked what would happen to Colin. She said he could be sued by the publisher for fraud, could face criminal charges if they wanted to pursue it, could be blacklisted from ever publishing again. Good, I said. He deserves all of that. We compiled the evidence package that afternoon.
Every draft of my manuscript with metadata showing creation and modification dates, screenshots of the file properties showing I was the author, my query letters to agents, all addressed to Simone Castellano, all dated months before Colleen even claimed to have started writing. Rejection letters from agents addressed to me, referencing my manuscript by its original title.
Email exchanges with agents where they'd critiqued specific scenes that appeared word for word in Colin's supposedly original work. We included a side-by-side comparison, my manuscript and Colin's, highlighting identical passages. There were hundreds, entire chapters that were exactly the same except for character names, dialogue that matched word for word, descriptions, metaphors, internal monologues, all identical. The only significant changes were superficial. Names, locations, minor plot adjustments. The heart of the work, the voice, the language, the story was mine. Diane sent the package to Pinnacle Publishing's legal department on a Thursday evening. She sent copies to Jennifer Wong, Colin's editor, and to the publisher's CEO. She included a formal letter demanding they halt all publication activities, void Colin's contract, and investigate the fraud. She gave them 72 hours to respond before we filed a lawsuit. Jennifer Huang called me directly the next morning. Her voice was shaking. She said she'd been up all night reading my evidence, that she'd compared my drafts to Colin's submission and they were undeniably the same work, that she felt sick, that she'd been so excited about this manuscript, had fought to acquire it, had championed Colin as a debut author, and now she realized she'd been lied to, that the publisher had been defrauded, that she personally felt betrayed. She said Pinnacle was voiding Colin's contract immediately, that their legal team was already drafting termination documents, that Colin would be required to return the advance money he'd already received, about $20,000 spent on I didn't even want to know what. She said the publisher was considering legal action against him for fraud and breach of contract. And then she said something that made my heart stop. She said Pinnacle wanted to offer me the contract instead. The same terms, $75,000 advance, 2-book deal, publication next fall, but only if I wanted it, only if I could trust them after what had happened, only if I was willing to work with the same publisher that had almost stolen my work. I asked for 24 hours to think about it. Jennifer said of course, said she understood if I wanted to take the manuscript elsewhere, that I'd be completely justified. But she hoped I'd consider staying with Pinnacle because she genuinely loved the book. She'd loved it when she thought Colin wrote it, and she loved it now knowing I did. The work was brilliant, regardless of who submitted it, and she wanted to be the editor who brought it into the world. I talked to Diane.
She said the offer was legitimate and fair, that Pinnacle was trying to make this right, that they were as much victims of Colin's fraud as I was. I talked to Aisha. She said I should take the deal, that this was what I'd wanted all along, that I'd earned this. I called my mother, told her everything. She cried, said Gabriella would be so proud, that this book was always mine, and now everyone would know it. I accepted Pinnacle's offer on Saturday morning. Jennifer sent the contract by Monday. I signed it Wednesday. The same contract Colin had signed. Same advance, same publication timeline, same everything. Except the author name, Simone Castellano. My name.
Finally, Colin tried to fight it. He hired a lawyer who claimed the work was transformative, that he'd made sufficient changes to create a derivative work. Pinnacle's legal team crushed that argument in about 90 minutes. They demonstrated that over 90% of the text was identical to my original manuscript, that the changes Colin had made were cosmetic at best, that he'd admitted in emails to Jennifer that his wife was a writer and had inspired the story, a tacit acknowledgement that the work originated with me. The publisher sued Colin for the return of the advance plus legal fees and damages, $20,000 he'd already spent, plus another $30,000 in fees and penalties. He didn't have it. He'd spent the advance money on a new car, on expensive dinners, on a vacation to Napa Valley he'd taken while I was still grieving my sister. He tried to negotiate a payment plan. The publisher refused. They wanted full repayment immediately, or they'd pursue wage garnishment and asset seizure. Colin's employer found out about the lawsuit. Someone in HR saw the news coverage. Publishing industry blogs were writing about the case. Debut author exposed for plagiarizing his wife's manuscript. Marketing director commits literary fraud. The optics were terrible. Colin's company put him on administrative leave while they investigated whether he'd violated any ethics policies. He was fired 2 weeks later, not for the plagiarism directly, but for conduct unbecoming, for damage to the company's reputation, for judgment inconsistent with their values. I filed for divorce in March. Colin contested it, said I was abandoning our marriage over a misunderstanding, that we could work through this, that he'd made a mistake, but he still loved me. I sat across from him in the mediator's office, and I asked him one question. When he'd submitted my manuscript to the publisher, when he'd signed the contract, when he'd cashed the advance check, when he'd celebrated his book deal, had he ever planned to tell me the truth? Had he ever intended to give me credit, to share the byline, to acknowledge that the work was mine? He didn't answer. The mediator marked the silence in her notes. The divorce was finalized in June. The Space Between Us was published in October under my name, Simone Castellano. The cover was beautiful, understated, elegant. The dedication read, "For Gabriella, who taught me that love doesn't end when life does." The acknowledgments thanked Aisha for her friendship, Diane for her advocacy, Jennifer for her belief in the work, and my mother for her support. Colin's name appeared nowhere in the book. The reviews were extraordinary. Publishers Weekly called it a devastating portrait of grief and sisterhood. Kirkus said it was essential reading for anyone who'd ever lost someone they loved. It got starred reviews from 3 major publications. Independent booksellers championed it. It sold 12,000 copies in the first month. Pinnacle ordered a second printing. I did a book tour, readings in 8 cities. People came and cried and told me about their own sisters, their own losses. A woman in Portland told me she'd been estranged from her sister for 6 years, and my book had made her reach out. They were talking again, meeting for coffee next week. I signed her book and couldn't speak for 5 minutes. Jennifer called me in December, said Pinnacle wanted to exercise the option on the second book, asked if I had something in progress. I did. I'd started writing again after the divorce. A different story, but still about women and family and the ways we survive impossible things. I sent her the first 100 pages. She called me 2 days later and said it was even better than the first book. We signed the contract in January. The second book publishes next month. Cohen won't be anywhere near it. Last I heard, he was working in sales for a software company, living in a studio apartment, still paying off the debt to Pinnacle. He tried to contact me once, about a year after the divorce, sent a letter to my publisher asking them to forward it to me. Jennifer called and asked if I wanted it. I said no. She said she'd shred it. Whatever Colin had to say, I didn't need to hear it. Aisha asks me sometimes if I regret how public the whole thing became. The lawsuit, the articles, the industry gossip, my first publication being tied to scandal instead of just being celebrated for the work. I tell her I don't regret anything. Because Colin was counting on me staying quiet, on me accepting his version of events, on me prioritizing our marriage and the money over my own authorship. He thought I'd be grateful for the crumbs he offered, the dedication, the acknowledgement, the shared financial benefit. He was wrong. I didn't want crumbs. I wanted my name on the cover of a book I'd written with my sister's memory pouring through every sentence. I wanted readers to know that Simone Castellano had created this story. That the words were mine. That the grief and love and hope embedded in those pages came from my experience, my loss, my healing. Diane tells other writers about my case now, in seminars about protecting your intellectual property. She says the digital age makes plagiarism easier, but also makes proof easier, that metadata is your friend, that timestamps don't lie, that if you're a writer, you should keep everything, every draft, every revision, every email, every query letter. Because you never know when you'll need to prove that your work is yours. Jennifer tells people about it too, in panels about publishing ethics. She says editors have a responsibility to verify authorship, to ask questions when something feels off, to investigate when someone submits work that seems too polished, too complete, too unlike anything they've done before. She said there were signs with Colin's submission that she missed, that he'd never mentioned writing before, that he couldn't answer detailed questions about his process, that his marketing background didn't naturally align with literary fiction. She should have dug deeper. She didn't, and it almost cost me everything. I think about that sometimes, how close Colin came to getting away with it. If I hadn't seen that email, if I hadn't opened his laptop, if I'd believed his explanations and convinced myself I was being paranoid, he would have published my book under his name, would have built a career on my work, would have done interviews and readings and accepted praise for words I'd written while crying over my sister's death. But I did see the email. I did open the laptop. I did trust my instincts over his gaslighting. And when I found proof of what he'd done, I didn't protect him. I didn't minimize it. I didn't accept his rationalizations about marriage and collaboration and shared benefit. I called a lawyer. I compiled evidence. I sent that evidence to the publisher at 11 p.m. on a Thursday night, and by 6 a.m., Pinnacle's legal team had opened it. By 9 a.m., they'd verified it. By noon, they'd voided Colin's contract. By end of business, they'd offered me the deal I'd earned. People ask me what it felt like, that moment when Jennifer called and said they wanted to publish my book under my name. I tell them it felt like vindication and grief in equal measure. Vindication because I was right. The manuscript was good enough, it was publishable. It just needed the right path to publication. And grief because Gabriella should have been there to see it. Should have been the first person I called when I signed the contract. Should have come to my book launch and cried proud tears and told everyone her big sister was an author. She wasn't there, but I wrote the book for her anyway. And I fought to keep my name on it because she'd taught me that some things are worth fighting for, even when you're exhausted, even when someone you love is telling you to let it go, even when the easier path is silence. Colin wanted my silence, my complicity, my willingness to disappear so he could shine. I gave him accountability instead, avoided contract, a lawsuit, a termination, a divorce, public exposure of exactly what he'd done, and I gave myself what I'd always deserved. My name on a book cover, my words in readers' hands, my story told the way I'd written it, not transformed, not improved, not fixed, just mine, completely, undeniably, legally mine, the way it had always been.
You've just stepped into her revenge side, where every wound finds its justice, and every silence ends with truth. If her story struck a chord, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. Another secret waits in the next video. See how her revenge begins.